Good afternoon. I just wanted to state at the very outset that we will not read the chapter right at the beginning, as we will be reading each verse as we go along in the study. Now, in chapters 5 and 6, the Apostle Paul is dealing with discipline in the Church of God. And we have been reminded that one of the reasons why this epistle was selected was because of church discipline. Now, in chapter 5, the Apostle Paul dealt with matters of a moral nature. But when we come to chapter 6, you find that he addresses matters that are both moral and material in nature. In this chapter, the Apostle Paul is dealing with three broad subjects. The first subject is litigation. This is addressed in verses 1 through 8. The second subject is condemnation, and that is addressed in verses 9 through 11. And the third subject which the Apostle Paul deals with is the subject of fornication, and this is addressed in verses 12 through 20. Now, given that this is an interactive Bible study, and given the limited time I have at my disposal, I found that, by the time I reached verse 11, I had already at least 30 minutes of material. And so what I'm going to do is, I will not cover the entire chapter. I shall cover the first two topics of litigation and condemnation, which are covered through verses 1 through 11. And I will encourage brothers who are led by the Spirit to express their thoughts during the interactive portion, to cover verses 12 through 20 and express their thoughts. Or if they have any additional thoughts on verses 1 through 11, they are welcome to give it during the interactive portion of the study. So let's dive right into the subject. You have the first topic which is covered, which is litigation. And as far as the issue of litigation is concerned, the Apostle Paul says that there are three issues which are in play here. Now, one of the easier ways to remember this message for today is to remember the letter C. And so in verses 1 through 4, you find one of the issues is the court. And then in verses 5 through 7, you find the critic. And in verse 8, you find the crime. So you have the court, the critic, and the crime. Now let's look at the court. It's covered in verses 1 through 4. With regards to the court, the Apostle Paul says there are two types of courts that are in play here, and each court has a separate jurisdiction. So first of all, he says there is the secular court, and you find that in verse 1. He says, "Dare any of you, having a matter against another, go to the law before the unjust, and not before the saints." So Paul first describes it to us, and then he denies it to us as a means for Christians suing other Christians. Now remember, we are talking about Christians suing another Christian. Paul describes the law courts of the Gentiles as those of the unjust. That's what he uses. The word he uses is the unjust. Now the same word for the unjust is again used in Acts chapter 24 and verse 15. And there it is used with the idea to differentiate between saved people and unsaved people. So it is not that Paul thought that you cannot get justice in a secular court of law. After all, if you really think about it, he himself had been exonerated by the Roman proconsul at Corinth in Acts chapter 18. So he did get justice in Acts chapter 18. So the important point that Paul is trying to make it here is that in church matters, that church matters should be settled within the church and not before the outside world. You see, the church's corporate testimony before the world is damaged when the church members engage in public lawsuits against each other. Now, these things must be kept within the family, is what Paul is saying. Now, if you really think about it, in the Jewish communities all around the world, they have a mechanism in place wherein they settle matters between Jews within their internal system. and not go outside. Not that they don't go outside, but I'm saying is that if they can settle it within themselves, they want to settle it amongst themselves. So that's pretty much what Paul is trying to get the point across. The second quote which Paul mentions is found in verses 2 through 4, and this is the sacred quote. So the first was the secular quote, he denies it to us, and then you have the sacred quote. And let's look at verses 2 through 4. Do ye not know that the saints shall judge the world? And if the world shall be judged by you, are ye unworthy to judge the smallest of matters? Know ye not that we shall judge angels? How much more things that pertain to this life? If then ye have the judgment of things pertaining to this life, set them to judge who are the least esteemed in the church. So Paul says the sacred court has two spheres of operation, namely a higher sphere and a human sphere. Now let's look at those two aspects, the higher sphere and the human sphere. The higher sphere of operation, you find it in verses 2 and the beginning portion of verse 3. Paul says that the saints are going to judge this world down here. This would be entirely consistent with Daniel chapter 7 verse 22, where it says, until the Ancient of Days came and judgment was given to the saints of the Most High. And the time came that the saints possess the kingdom. Now what Paul is arguing in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 is that we are going to judge the world. So how much more we should be able to judge the relatively minor matters that come within the sphere of the church. Paul secondly says that the saints are going to judge the world up there. Some future date, the saints will have the dignity, the destiny, and the duty to judge angels. Now I assume when that word angels is used, I'm assuming that they have presumably the fallen angels of Satan that the saints will be judging in that higher sphere. So if that is our portion, then how is it that we consider ourselves unworthy to judge the smallest of matters, is what Paul is laying out. Now I told you there's a higher sphere and the human sphere. Now let's look at the verses, the second part of verse 3 and verse 4, where you find the human sphere of operation. Now having indicated that we are competent and having indicated our competence in the higher sphere, Paul at once moves to the human sphere, and he straight away indicates that, first of all, he indicates the competence. And he says the competence is indicated here. He says he indicates this competence by saying how much more, especially in things pertaining to this life. Now, if we will have wisdom to be judging angels, then certainly we can be trusted to have wisdom to judge the smallest of matters, is what Paul is laying out. And then, secondly, the competence is illustrated. He illustrates this competence by doing a contrast. In verse 4 he says, if then ye have judgment of things pertaining to this life, set them to judge who are the least esteemed in the church. Now Paul is saying that by going to the pagan judges or to the Gentile judges, you are laying matters before those who have absolutely no status in the church. Now there are two ways to look at this when Paul says that the least esteemed of the church should be appointed to judge this matter. The first view, which I subscribe to, was I think Paul is being sarcastic here when he says to lay the matter before those who are the least esteemed in the church. Because in his view, even the least esteemed in the church is more qualified than a pagan who has absolutely no standing in the church. To resort to pagan magistrates would be implying that there is no one, absolutely no one in the church gifted enough to arbitrate between two disputing parties. Especially when the church, Corinthian church, when you think about it, had really some illustrious people in their midst. They had men like Erastus, who held the high office of the city treasurer. In fact, there's a gentleman by the name of Paul D. Gardner who has written a book called the New International Encyclopedia of Biblical Characters. And he says Erastus may have even acted as a lawyer of sorts in public disputes. So you have such an eminent person who has acted as a lawyer, who is very well known. He is the treasurer of the city, and you consider you still would go out into the public courts, is what Paul is asking. Couldn't you have used him? The second view is, you know what, the leaders and prominent ones in the church and in the world might already be the elders and deacons of the church. In contrast, the least esteemed brethren were probably the poorer members who had very little possessions and who counted for very little in the eyes of the world, who probably did not have many friends and did not have any personal prejudices. So they would be very apt to not apt to favor one over the other. They could be impartial. They have nothing to lose in the way of prestige or position or friends if they make a decision one way or the other. Because at the end of the day, a person who sits as an arbiter or a judge must be impartial. That is the center of jurisprudence, is that the judge must be impartial. Otherwise, what is the point in having a litigation in the first place? Now, if you really think about it, partiality can go in both ways. It can go in, you could have a bias or you could have a reverse bias. Now, let me use an illustration from my own personal life. When I was in the US, I used to play quite a bit of cricket on the weekends, and I was the skipper of my team. And on my team, there was a friend of mine by the name of Hari, and he was a part of my team, but we were playing for one weekend, one tournament where only I selected 12 players or 13 players, and Hari was not one of those 13 players, and just those 13 players were playing in that particular tournament. Now, Hari came to watch our game, and what happened is that the person who was supposed to umpire that game had an emergency and had to leave. So we needed an umpire. The opposition skipper came to me and said, "Hey, I heard Hari Haran is a very good umpire. We don't mind using him as an umpire, even though we know that he's part of your team in a different tournament. And but we trust his judgment to make a fair call." Now, I looked at it, and I was not very keen on that. I looked at it and I said, this guy is a very smart guy, but I had a feeling that reverse bias will creep in. So I went and I said, give me a minute, I'll discuss with my fellow players. I went and discussed with my fellow players, and 8 or 9 of them said, no, yeah, we should take him, definitely the calls will go our way. And I told them, I don't think so. You know what, I have a feeling that he might be more tougher on us. I don't think this is a good thing. I think it's a lose-lose situation for us. If we win the game, and they'll say that, your own umpire, he ruled in your favor. If we lose the game, they'll say, you know what, you had your own umpire and you still lost the game. So it's a no-win situation. I was dead against it, but majority of our players like, no, let's go it, let's not delay the game, let's get on with the game. Sure enough, we played the game. There was a ball going to center of center stump. As far as I know, that is plumb LBW. Not out. That was not the only decision. There were numerous decisions. All of them went against us. Now, I argued with the umpire on that one. I said, hey, tell me, why is that not out? I would like to know. Now, because everything which I know about LBW tells me that is out. And if that is not out, I do not know what is LBW. He said, well, I'll tell you why later after the game. I was very curious because everything I know told me that deserves to be out. And if that is not out, then you need to get rid of the LBW decision. So after the game, I asked him. He said, well, see, the thing is that, you guys are the stronger team, and I know that you guys are going to win. But if I give it out, I don't want the other side to say that I gave an LBW decision, which probably was this thing. So I said, so there you go. So that is reverse bias. Then you have bias, which is, I know you, and I will rule in your favor. But what I was trying to get at is, a judge should not be biased, nor should have reverse bias. A judge must be impartial. And that probably could be the reason why Paul here says, put the least esteemed and put them in the position of an arbiter, because the elders of the church probably were already the esteemed people, and they probably were the people with money and probably in well-off positions. And so usually the people in money and well-off positions are the ones who are bringing lawsuits against each other. The people who are poor, well, they hardly have anything, so what is there to fight about? But the person who has a lot probably, will not want to give up anything. So the idea being here, hear both sides, but then whoever is a judge, you need to be impartial in your counsel and in your judgment, because otherwise you're not doing your job well. Personally, I subscribe to view one, which is that, hey, you have such outstanding people in your church, and you're not using them, and you're going to the outside. So that is why Paul says, you could have at least put the least esteemed in the position of being an arbiter or a judge. Secondly, as I told you, there were three things, all starting with the letter C. In verses 5 through 7, you find the critic in play here. Who is the critic? The critic is Paul himself. Because the critic Paul is saying is that he cannot believe the unchristian-like believer or behavior of the Corinthian believers. As a critic, Paul emphasizes three things, and they all starts with the letter C again. First of all, it is Paul's chagrin, which is seen in verse 5a. And that is the first part of verse 5, where he says, I say this to your shame. The word for shame used here is the same word used in Psalm 69 verse 19, where David confessed to God his shame and his revulsion at the very thought of his sin. Paul is telling the Corinthian believers that they should be ashamed of themselves in the same way David was ashamed of himself. And then you find Paul's challenge. You find that in verses 5 and 6. And he says, is it so that there is not among you anyone wise who will be able to decide between his brothers and sisters? But brother goes to law with brother, and that too before unbelievers. So once again you see that he says, are you not able to find anyone? Which is why I subscribe to view one, that it is not that you put the least esteem, but the thing is that couldn't you even have found somebody in your church who could have acted as an impartial judge? Now, as we said before, the Corinthian church had amongst themselves people like Erastus. As I told you, he was the city councillor, now city treasurer. Now, in 1 Corinthians 16, we see that they also had people like Stephanus, who had devoted themselves to the ministry of the saints. Paul, in fact, held Stephanus in high regard, that he even asked them to be subject to people like such Stephanus. Paul also mentions people like Fortunatus and Achaeus. And he said their ministries were like a benediction. If you look in Romans 16, we gather that the Corinthian church had people like Lucius, Sosipater, Jason, and Tertius. In fact, Tertius had even acted as Paul's secretary at times. They also had amongst their midst a person by the name of Gaius, who was very famous for his generosity. So once again, I feel that Paul is being sarcastic when he says that, when he poses the challenge to the Corinthian church as to why you were not able to find anyone wise amongst you to decide matters, when he himself, he was sitting far away, could think of so many people. So Paul lays this challenge, because he knows that when brother goes against brother before the law and before unbelievers, they are essentially squabbling openly in court before pagan magistrates, and this mars the Christian testimony. Now, this concept of going to a secular court is a warning to a believer not to take the first step, not to take the first initiative to go to court against another believer. But nothing can be done. So I want to make it very clear. Nothing can be done when the other believer forcefully takes you to court. If another believer forcefully takes you to court, by law, you have to show up in court when summoned. And Christians are asked to obey the law. So you don't have a choice at that point of time. If somebody forcefully takes you to court, you have to show up in court. But you at least did not take that first step. Now, Paul's charge is seen in verse 7. That's the third thing which you see is Paul's charge. Why not rather suffer the wrong? Why not rather be defrauded? Paul is basically saying that there is a more excellent way. There is a higher and holier law in play, and that is the law of love. Now, years ago, and I'm again going to delve into my own personal life, I was taken to court. Despite my best efforts to keep it out of court, I was taken to court. Now, without going into the specifics, I had agreed to every demand of the other party. I can truthfully say that before God because I have written proof of that. And in return, I had asked for only one thing that was top priority for me. I asked for 28.57%, that is the exact percentage of that thing. Even though I knew that rightfully I was entitled to 50%. If I went to court, I could get 50%. But I did not want to fight it in court. I just wanted 28.57%, which I felt was reasonable. In return, I was offered 1.19%. Now God and I know, and my parents know, the endless tears I shed as I found this extremely unreasonable. At the same time, I knew scripture and I did not want to go to court. So I was stuck between a rock and a hard place. You see, I was in a situation where I could neither spit it out, nor could I swallow it, and I was totally clueless what to do. And I spent a lot of time in prayer at that time. While I was still trying to process this turn of events and what to do, I found that the other party went unilaterally to court. And here I was summoned to appear in a court of law. Now the matter was in the courts, and now the matter is out of both parties' hands, and the courts were going to have their say. Now as time progressed, I found that I went from 0% to 1.19%. to 20%. 4 years later, I was at 45%. 6 years later, I was at 50%. 11 years later, I was at 100%. Now, based on personal recollections which have been recounted to me privately, I know of a believer in our own assembly, whom all of you know very well, but you may not know his circumstances. But I know of a believer in our own assembly who had to give up a lot of material wealth that was rightfully his. But he gave things up to buy peace. But as time progressed, God blessed him so abundantly that all the past losses pales in comparison to the blessings which God has blessed him with. Paul's charge here is, why not rather suffer the wrong? Why not rather be defrauded? The worldly wise person would then say, then this brother who is doing the wrong will be able to get away with fraud. Well, my answer to that would be yes and no. The matter, if you ask me, just got referred to a higher court. And that's what we were talking about, was the two types of courts, and it just got referred to the higher court. In the higher court, the person in the wrong often will find eventually a golden principle that though the mills of God grind exceedingly slow, yet they grind exceedingly small. Though with exceeding patience God stands waiting, yet with exceeding exactness grinds he all. I personally fully believe, and this is my personal conviction, that I fully believe in it, that when we leave the matter in God's hands, it will always work out in the end. And finally, you see in verse 8, the last of the C's, you find the crime. In verse 8, Paul puts his finger on the crime. He says, on the contrary, you yourself do wrong and do fraud, and thus to your own brothers and sisters. You see, if you ask me, all wrongdoing and fraud are criminal behavior. But for a brother to take that initiative to wrong and defraud another brother only aggravates the culpability of the guilty party. Believers who are true believers should not engage in that kind of crime. Now the second thing is, as I told you, in verses 9 through 11, you find condemnation. Paul now turns to the subject from the previous subject which we considered in verses 1 through 9 to the second subject on hand, which is condemnation. And he straightaway lays the question, or do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Paul is wondering if some of these so-called Corinthian believers were even saved. The kind of behavior he had just denounced of brother taking brother to court and defrauding other people and engaging in litigation in pagan courts, and the kind of behavior he is going to denounce going forward in the next few verses is behavior characteristic of the unregenerate and not behavior which is characteristic of the saved. Paul then gives a searching denunciation by saying, do not be deceived. In other words, do not be deceived into thinking that those who continue this kind of immoral, scandalous lives can still go to heaven. Doing so is self-deception than anything else. So in verses 9 and 10, Paul exposes the wickedness when he reels off a list of sins. These sins can be classified, if you ask me, under two categories. First category would be sins of a personal nature. Now these would be sins such as fornication. We read about this in Numbers 25:1 that Israel abode in Shittim, and the people began to commit fornication with the daughters of Moab. This, if you ask me, is a sexual sin. Then you have the sin of idolatry. This is a spiritual sin. God had commanded Israel, ye shall make yourself no idols nor any graven images. But what did Israel do? Israel was guilty of breaking this command many times over. Then you have the sin of adultery. An example of this would be David's sin with Bathsheba, who was another man's wife. This, if you ask me, is a social sin because it destroys not only your family, it destroys someone else's family too. And eventually, that kind of things unchecked destabilizes the entire society and the entire country. Then you have alternate lifestyle sins. And these things have now been made pretty much standard all across the United States and in many other countries of the world. These are sins of depravity. And if you ask me, they are a sin against nature itself. Then you have sins of a public nature. These would be sins such as thieves. That is an outward act where you take that which is not yours. If you look at the Bible, you have an example. It says that Judas was a thief. Here it is a lack of control of the wants. You are not able to control your wanting desire within you. And to satisfy that want, you adopt this thieving business. Then you have covetousness. That is a problem, if you ask me, of the inward attitude. Who would be a covetous man? I can think of Gehazi in the Bible. He displayed that covetous attitude when he coveted the silver of Naaman, when the prophet had already said he did not want anything from Naaman. That, if you ask me, is a lack of control of the wants. Drunkards. Now, if you ask me, this is habitual intoxication. Well, if I think of look through the Bible, I mean, if I can, top of my head, I can think of Herod and of Belshazzar, who in their drunken state committed great acts of folly. I would just want to bring here that in the previous church which I used to attend, I had a gentleman who used to sit to the right of me. And that brother, I had noticed, whenever the wine was passed around, he used to take part in the bread, but he never used to take part in the wine. And then I found out the reason later on. Apparently what happened was that, in his before conversion, he was a big drunkard. And so he had kicked that habit. He had become a Christian. And now when the wine, and there it is the actual wine which is passed around, he did not want to take even that small sip of wine because he did not want to fall. So he refused to take part in the wine. Eventually, much later, several years later, the church made sure that they put white grape juice along with this thing, and that was specifically just meant for him so that he can take part in the bread and the wine too. But what is drunkenness? It is a lack of control over your own will. Your will is so weak that you are not able to control it. Then you have the category of revilers. Now, if you ask me, a reviler is a person who assaults others with his tongue by making false accusations. If you think about it in the Bible, the Pharisees is a classic example because they were guilty of reviling the Lord Jesus Christ. That, if you ask me, is a lack of control over their tongue or a lack of control over your words. And then you have extortioners. Who is a classical extortioner which I can think of in the Bible would be Zacchaeus, who before his conversion was an extortioner. Zacchaeus was a publican, a Jewish man who collected taxes from the Romans. Now, most of the Jewish people considered the tax collectors to be traitors. They considered them to be turncoats and collaborators. In addition, they hated them for their cruelty, their injustice, and their greed. If you think about it, Roman taxes, the way it was collected in those days, worked differently than our taxation system works presently. The Roman government at that time told the regional governors, you know what, your region needs to send this much money from your region to Rome as tax. The governors, what they did is they in turn hired private tax collectors, and one of them would be Zacchaeus. They hired these tax collectors and gave them separate areas and said, you know what, it's your responsibility. Go and gather the money and let us and give the tax back to us. These tax collectors then they went ahead and collected the money and goods as tax from various people. Who the tax collectors took the money from and how they took it really didn't matter. And if the tax collectors collected more than they needed, which is often the case, if you needed X amount of dollars, they collected X plus Y amount of dollars from the people. They sent the X amount of dollars to the Roman governor, who then passed it on to Rome. But they got to keep the Y amount of the excess dollars which they collected. And so they got to keep the difference. This, if you ask me, is a lack of control of their ways. So we looked at a lack of control of the wants, we looked at a lack of control of their tongue or their words, and then you have a lack of control over their ways, and then also a lack of control over the will, which we discussed in intoxication. So if you really think about it, we have a whole bunch of sins. Both you have sins of a public nature and sins of a personal nature. And if you think about it, what a catalog of sins. It is to these people that Paul was giving the warning that persisting in these kind of wicked sins habitually shows that you are engaging in self-deception by thinking you are saved. It is not, let me reiterate again, it is not that a saved person cannot fall, or that a saved person, once they fall, they have to be restored back to fellowship. It is a question really of the flow of a person's life. Let's not get too technical over it. I want to reiterate that from time to time even believers fall, but I really want to stress the point is, what is the flow of direction in the believer's life? Let me illustrate that with a practical example. Now, all of you have heard of the River Nile. If you really look at it, the River Nile flows from the south to the north. And because it flows from the Great Lakes of Central Africa and empties itself in the Mediterranean Sea. The land between that is divided into various cataracts, but between the fifth cataract and the fourth cataract, the great river turns west, and then it turns south. Between the fourth cataract and the third cataract, it turns again and heads in a northwesterly direction. At a place called Dur, the river changes direction yet again, and it starts flowing to the south and to the east. And then it turns for one last time and heads north as it heads straight for the delta of the Mediterranean Sea. Now, if somebody was standing at a point just beyond Dur, and if they were asked, which way does the river flow? That person would say, hey, the river flows south. But he would be wrong. The river actually flows north. It flows from south to north. But its various twists and turns are not the same, and is not the same as the normal and general direction of the flow, but rather they are only temporary aberrations. I believe the same is true of a genuine believer's life. The great question is, in what direction does the believer's life flow? Is it toward holiness, or is it towards worldliness? If you think about the biblical account, you have David committed adultery. Jonah ran away from God's call. Peter denied the Lord with oaths and curses. Elijah ran away from Jezebel. Abraham denied Sarah in Egypt, and he again denied her in Gerar. All of these great men of the Bible have failed at some point in their lives. But God did not cast them away, did he? We believers might be ready to throw the first stone at one of them, but God did not cast them away. Let's look at the stream of life in their life. The stream may seem to be bent, but I want you to observe closer. What did David do? David wept bitterly over his sin. And what did David do? He penned numerous tear-drenched penitential psalms, which you and I read, and how many of us have been blessed from those psalms? Jonah, what about him? Well, he eventually headed for Nineveh, and he preached what God wanted him to preach after all. What about Peter? He fell. How many times? Numerous times. But he even denied the Lord. If it was us, we will excommunicate him. I don't believe that we are, adopting that holier than thou attitude is the right approach. Because God himself, if God can forgive him and use him, and look at Peter, he preached boldly to multitudes after Christ's resurrection. How many thousand souls were added to the church? What about Elijah? He confronted Ahab again. Sure, he ran from Jezebel. But 1 Kings 18 says that Elijah stood before God. What about Abraham? Yeah, sure, he denied Sarah and he failed and things like that. But look at him, he's headed toward Mount Moriah to sacrifice his promised son. In each of these cases, the real flow of life had simply reasserted itself. Things have straightened out. The main direction of the flow of their life has again become very clear. It is not that saved people cannot fall, that the kinds of sins which characterize them in their unregenerate race, that they don't sometimes fall back into it. However, they do not continue in those sins. They bitterly repent of their fall and seek God's face again. They continue on their way toward heaven. However, the unregenerate have no such current toward holiness in their lives. They habitually sin, and then they make it worse by excusing themselves for it. And Paul finishes this section in verse 11 by acknowledging what they had been, what these Corinthian believers had been. He says, such were some of you. These were the kind of people that Paul had preached the gospel to. Paul had seen lives being transformed. Indeed, the Lord Jesus is the only person who can save from the guttermost, if there is a word like that, from the guttermost to the uttermost. That is what happened in Corinth when people had been picked out from the gutter and turned toward heaven. In the process, these believers had been sanctified and had been justified. They had been set apart for God and set aright by God. Every believer, if you ask me, ought to see to it that holiness becomes the prevailing character of their life, as in the direction of their life flow. Here is a well-known truth. A sinner accommodates himself to his sin, while a saint abominates his sin. I'll repeat that line again. A sinner accommodates himself to his sin, while a saint abominates his sin. Now, long back I read this in the Daily Bread about ermines, and maybe some of you have read this, will remember this, it'll jog back your memory, which is, if you ask me, is a very pretty little creature with a white coat. And these coats are extremely expensive. And so the bags which are made out of ermine coats are very, very expensive. The trapper who traps the ermine waits until the ermine leaves the nest to hunt for food. And what does the trapper then do? He puts filth and garbage at the door of the ermine's home. Very simple method here. The ermine then sees the trapper at some point of time. He realizes the danger it is in, and it heads whole for its safety. So these ermines are tough to catch. But when it gets to this hole, it finds that its entrance is covered with filth and garbage, and it won't go in, and it will turn away from the home. Its nature is such that it will not allow its coat to get sullied or dirty. It rather be dead than defiled. It would rather be dead than defiled. That is how the trapper traps the ermine. If you ask me, such too should be the attitude, surely, of the Christian who has learned the truth of justification and sanctification. If you ask me what is the difference between the pig and the ermine, I'll tell you it is this. With regards to a pig, you can take it into your personal bathroom, give it a perfume bath, and take it outside at the very first opportunity the pig gets, and it sees dirt. It will wallow in the dirt because the pig is at home in the filth and the cesspool of this world. On the other hand, the ermine, it would rather die maintaining its purity than be defiled. We as Christians must be like the ermine. If we love wallowing in sin, then we are like the pig. May God bless this portion of scripture to our spiritual growth. Thank you so much for your time. Sorry I couldn't cover the entire chapter, but hopefully other brothers who are led by the Spirit can chime in with their views on the portion we did not cover, as well as the portion which we have covered. Thank you.